Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me thank the organizers for allowing me this opportunity to speak with you this afternoon from the small islands of the Caribbean. The presentation that I'm going to give is going to show you, I think, a slightly different perspective than some of the academic presentations you have heard before. And like many of the presenters, I too am not a lawyer. My background is, in fact, agricultural engineering, and I've had a very diverse working experience in both the private and public sector. At one stage, I worked at an industrial research institute, designing machinery, and this is what introduced me to the patent system. And later on in the mid-90s, I helped establish the Intellectual Property Office in Trinidad and Tobago, where I am from. And this was just at the time of the TRIPS agreement. So we introduced a lot of new laws on intellectual property in order to comply with the TRIPS agreement. I had the opportunity then to become the patent examiner in the Trinidad office. And we helped to develop that office, which now has 4 patent examiners and a number of trademark examiners, of course. So I also, somewhere within that framework, worked in the private sector as a marketing manager. And now I work with the Caribbean Community Secretariat in the Office of Trade Negotiations. And I had the excellent and very enjoyable opportunity to work on the Economic Partnership Agreement for the CARICOM group of countries, which includes the Dominican Republic. So the perspective that I come from, I think, is in that context quite different to some of the earlier presenters. I would like to talk to you about 3 different components of the another technical challenge.
I think this is in this. No?
Okay, so I'll continue while they sort that out. The 3 areas I want to talk to you about are, first of all, to give you an idea of the CARICOM construct, the arrangement that we have amongst the very small islands of the Caribbean.
Use this one.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So a snapshot just of the states of the Caribbean community. And then, as I have been requested, I will talk a little bit about regional convergence within the CARICOM community, within the Caribbean community, and then about intellectual property convergence in that context. So in the context of a snapshot of the Caribbean community, I think I only need 4 words. We're very small. We're vulnerable. A great deal of diversity, as you will see, and we need money. We're highly indebted. St. Kitts, one of the smallest amongst us, has a debt to GDP ratio of over 140%. The others are not that far behind. I think the biggest economy in the region, Trinidad and Tobago, has a debt to GDP about 60. That's the strongest economy. But most of us have much higher debt to GDP ratios. So we have a problem. these are the 15 states of the Caribbean community. As you will see, most of them are English-speaking, except for Haiti and Suriname, who are members of our community. There are, at the moment, 2 associate members, Montserrat, which is a dependency of the United Kingdom, and Martinique has just been approved to become an associate member of our community, and as you know, that is actually part of French territory. To give you a sense of the kind of diversity that we have in the region, and a sense of what I mean by being very small, now this is going to present some difficulties.
Exactly here.
Okay. Yeah. You try it? Okay. All
If you
right.
would like help, I can stay here.
Well, if you show me what exactly you did. The
if you-
cursor has to
yeah,
be there.
it goes
Okay.
here and
So when it
second
moves,
right
okay.
here.
Right, got it, yeah. Okay, so I must go back now to the previous slide. There you go. So in terms of size, the largest amongst us is Guyana on the South American continent, 215 square kilometers, so really quite large in terms of area. St. Kitts and Nevis, 261 square miles. Probably can fit in Santo Domingo, maybe, a little bit outside. Population size, Haiti, of course, as you well know here, is just over 10 million people. Again, St. Kitts, the smallest, is only 53,000 people. In terms of GDP per capita, our colleague was talking about the relationship between GDP per capita and other metrics of innovation. Well, St. Kitts has a GDP per capita, Haiti has a GDP per capita of 1,300 US dollars per annum, and the Bahamas, 31,000. I don't think that's necessarily an indication of the level of innovation in the Bahamas. So I think some of the models that were presented may have a challenge within the construct of these very small states. So what is it that these very diverse economies have in common? Well, we produce a very narrow range of commodity exports. I think that's the bottom line of it. We do not produce the higher value-added products that was being suggested earlier we need to do. And as a result, these commodities are subject to price fluctuations in the international market, which we can have no control over because our economies of scale are too small. We just will never be big enough to influence global prices with our production. We have very high inherent costs because everything that a big economy does, we have to do, except we can only produce on a small scale. And in terms of education, although we do have a strong education system, which I'll describe more a little later on, 80% of the citizens of the region who go to tertiary education leave the region to work in an OECD country. So that gives you an idea of what I mean by size. So let me tell you about regional convergence. We have been trying to establish an integration process amongst these CARICOM countries for some time. Just before independence in the late 50s, we tried to establish what we call the West Indian Federation. That lasted a couple of years, and then it fractured. So we next tried to establish a free trade area in the 60s, the mid-60s. And that worked reasonably well. So it gave us the idea that perhaps we could build on a regional trading arrangement amongst ourselves, and we built that into a community. So in the 70s, we established the Caribbean community, and that began, of course, with a Caribbean common market as an integral part of it. And then in the late 80s and the early 90s, we moved towards establishing a Caribbean single market and economy. So the revised treaty establishing the Caribbean community establishes within the Caribbean countries, the CARICOM countries, a single market and economy. Now, the elements of achieving this treaty objective are taking some time to be put in place. So we, at the moment, consider ourselves to have created a single market, but we do not yet have the elements that would allow us to achieve the objective of a single economy. So a little bit about what our construct is like now. The highest decision-making body that sets policy for this regional integration group is the Conference of Heads of Government, which meets formally in July every year and has a second interim meeting in January every year. So they meet twice a year, and they set policy for the region. This policy is by full consensus. Now, what this means, as I told you, is that 15 sovereign states must all agree in order for policy to become regional policy. If any one does not agree, then it does not become regional policy. So all 15 independent sovereign states must agree. Within this construct, we have councils of ministers that deal with different issues, foreign affairs, economic development, social and human development. And we have the CARICOM Secretariat that I work for, which is an administrative body which helps to coordinate and manage these various arrangements at the political level. Within the region, as part of our integration construct, we have a University of the West Indies, which has 4 campuses, one in Jamaica, one in Trinidad and Tobago, and one in Barbados. And the 4th one is an open campus, which has recently been established, which allows online tertiary education. So that allows those other states who previously had to travel to either one of the 3 physical campuses to engage with the university online and acquire their education that way. There are currently plans for 2 more campuses, a second one in Jamaica and a second one in Trinidad and Tobago. As part of the regional construct, I should also say that there are national universities in Guyana, in Trinidad and Tobago, and there are a number of, and UTEC in Jamaica, and there are also a number of other universities that are being established across the region, many of them private universities, and many of them also what we call offshore universities, universities that are designed and managed usually out of the United States for students to enter United States tertiary education institutions having come to one of the offshore universities as a pre-qualification for that entry. And as part of that construct, we have established something called the Caribbean Knowledge Learning Network, which is an information technology infrastructure that is designed to allow the sharing of information amongst the member states of the region. I must say immediately that it is not working effectively. As you might imagine with sovereign states, there is always sensitivity about sharing information. This no doubt happens amongst institutions within a country, and so we are no exception to the tendency to build silos wherever human beings feel they have a center of power. So this gives you a sense of what the Caribbean community looks like. And what we have done recently is that we have developed at the community level a strategic plan for the period 2015 to 2019. That strategic plan has three main elements: innovation, competitiveness, and resilience, which we believe are designed to try to address many of the competitiveness challenges that we have found ourselves with that has resulted in our economic difficulties, as exemplified by the high external debt. One of the challenges, as I mentioned, was the economies of scale, and so our attention more recently has been focused on producing what we have described as weightless products. I was very pleased to hear Osvaldo mention the potential for the creative industries as economic centers, and in our part of the Caribbean, as industry is not necessarily going to achieve competitiveness because of the economy of scale challenge, we are turning towards the services environment, and particularly some areas like entertainment services, the information and communication technologies, which produce products that do not depend on economy of scale for their competitive pricing. We have established a regional science and technology policy. The work on that policy began before innovation became such a familiar term. Otherwise, I have no doubt it would be called a science, technology, and innovation policy. We have a committee on science, technology, and innovation, which has more recently been established, and therefore the very popular word innovation has found its way into their title. The two key areas that that committee is charged to focus on immediately are science education, beginning at this level of schools, so from about the age of 9 or 10, right up through tertiary education, and trying to construct means of funding research and development. Given the environment I described with very high debt to GDP ratios, our government expenditure on research and development is 0.7% of GDP at its highest and 0.3% of GDP at its lowest. So very little government expenditure, and as was mentioned earlier, we do not have accurate means of measuring any expenditure on what might be called research and development by the private sector. So product development does not have a specific category in the accounting system. So that's regional convergence. We have a community of very small states that are vulnerable and indebted. We have a construct that allows us to collaborate fairly effectively, but it has its challenges because of this independent sovereign right needing to achieve full consensus amongst 15 states. We have focused our attention on competitiveness through innovation and the use of science and technology in particular, recognizing that our strength may ultimately be in the creative sector rather than in the industrial sector. So how have we treated with intellectual property convergence? Well, one of the initial areas, which was built into the treaty in the 70s, was functional cooperation. And as a result, our intellectual property administrative units have all collaborated collectively with the assistance of WIPO in trying to design, by collaborating with each other and sharing experience, very much like your PILA network, and sharing that experience in order to help design each national intellectual property system. In the treaty as well, there is a requirement for the harmonization of laws. Quite a difficult task given 15 sovereign states. Our approach to it is to design model laws, which each of the states use as the basis for its later development of its national law. So there is a great deal of similarity, although, of course, the drafters of national legislation always feel that they need their turn of phrase to fit into their national legal framework. Of course, the WTO TRIPS agreement set the minimum standard of protection for intellectual property. So in many ways, that added to the harmonization of standards in intellectual property laws across the region. We also participate in the WIPO meetings, and the heads of the intellectual property units collectively often decide on the types of treaties that WIPO administers, which the Caribbean should become part of. Ultimately, though, it then comes back down to the national level for each member state to actually become a party to any of the treaties. So across the region, the main treaties everybody is a part of, but you will find that in some countries, certain treaties have been given priority, and in other countries, other treaties, although the intention is for all the member states eventually to accede to very much the same treaties. In the negotiation of the Economic Partnership Agreement with Europe, as I'm sure you here in the Dominican Republic will remember, there is a chapter on innovation and intellectual property. This was the first attempt that we as a community, a wider community in this case, sought to reframe the way in which we treated with intellectual property. In other words, that chapter, rather than many trade agreements did at the time, was not restricted simply to referring to the minimum standards of protection for intellectual property rights, but it has a section which deals with how ourselves and the European community will collaborate in order to improve our levels of innovation. An important component of that was Europe agreeing to give us access to many of their innovation support programs like Horizon 2020. At the time it was FP7, I think it's FP8, and it may now have a new name. But in each cycle of their innovation promotion programs, CARICOM entities have the opportunity to participate in those funding cycles in response to calls for proposals. So that's a reflection of how we began using our external trading arrangements to improve not only our intellectual property convergence, but also to ensure that intellectual property for us was framed within the context of innovation policy rather than simply intellectual property policy. We have taken this a little bit further in our negotiations with Canada, which have now been suspended because we were too far apart on some of the core issues of tariff reduction and services liberalization. But nevertheless, we completed a chapter on intellectual property, which had as the basis for its construct innovation corridors. These were patterned after internal mechanisms that Canada has between its provinces, for example, between Ontario and Quebec, which has a biotechnology innovation corridor. And this was designed to facilitate access for the creative work that we might be doing in the region to the commercialization machinery that Canada has within its economy. In the context of the copyright industries, the creative industries that use copyright as a basis for their competitive advantage or to protect their competitive advantage, we have a regional administration, a regional association of collective management organizations, which in fact will be meeting in the middle of August in Barbados. And of course, they collaborate regionally on any of the issues that arise in the context of the protection and enforcement of copyright material. And just this weekend past, during the meeting of the heads of the region in the conference that I described as the overarching policy body, they meet around July the 4th every year, they have confirmed a decision to establish a regional patent administration through the development of a Caribbean Patent Convention. And they anticipate signing that convention by their meeting in July next year. WIPO has very kindly assisted the region since 2009 in discussing and analyzing and developing a draft convention, and that convention will be finalized over the next year. And a regional patent office, in effect, will be established, which will allow a range of patent product from a single patent that covers the entire region to a bundle of patents. And in the context of one small part of our region, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, there is expected also to be a sub-regional administration of some kind. And then, of course, we have the IPICA project, which has very kindly facilitated my being present here this afternoon. And that project is also contributing to the coalescing of a range of initiatives in the area of innovation across the region and promoting the development of an environment that can encourage further innovation. So that is the end of my presentation. It means that we have a lot of time left for questions. I'm sure that you have many on some of the information that you heard before, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have on the Caribbean community and its efforts that run in parallel to your PILA network. Thank you very much.